Good evening. I hope you have your Bibles with you, and if you do, you open them to the Old Testament book of Ecclesiastes. We began last evening a series of studies out of the book of Ecclesiastes, striving to make some applications to those of us who are alive today from the words of the wise man. I believe that Solomon was the author of the book of Ecclesiastes. I believe that throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, he records a journal of his quest for for a lack of a better term, for the meaning of life. And we're going to look at various aspects of the things that he discovered and the things that he recorded in his journal. And we're going to be looking at some things that we began to develop last evening. We sort of gave an overview of some of the things that we want to talk about, and we're going to pick up on that and continue that through this Thursday evening. And to begin tonight, I want us to notice something that is recorded in the 4th chapter of the book of Ecclesiastes. We're going to look at verses 4 through 6. Ecclesiastes 4, beginning at verse 4. Again I saw that for all toil and every skillful work a man is envied by his neighbor. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. The fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. Better a handful with quietness than both hands full together with toil and grasping for the wind. Now, what we need to remember, this is said in the context of, like we indicated just a moment ago, Solomon beginning to test life. He starts out in the book by reminding us that there is this endless cycle that men go through upon the earth. As a matter of fact, he says, beginning in verse 3 of chapter 1, what profit has a man from all his labors in which he toils under the sun? One generation passes away, and another generation comes, but the earth abides forever. Now, he's not talking here about, he's not taking issue with something that the Apostle Peter would later write about in 2 Peter 3, when he talks about the earth and all the works that are in it are going to be destroyed. Solomon is not making the case that the earth is going to last forever. Really, all in the world that he is doing is teaching us of the endless cycle of life. We know that, we experience that. One generation comes and that generation grows old and dies, and another generation takes his place, and that's just the endless cycle of life that is under the sun. And so as Solomon begins to encounter that, he begins to search out life under the sun. What's the meaning? For what purpose am I here? What is real, and what's life all about? He said in chapter 1 and verse 13, he said, I set my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven. And so throughout the book, he records the things that he encountered. We're going to look at one of those this evening, as we've already begun in chapter 4. Now, we go all the way to the end of the book, and we find that he reaches a fantastic conclusion. He said, after trying this and trying that, and going through all of these things that he went through, he said, hey, you know what? You know what I discovered? Hey, here's the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole of man, or the whole duty of man. And so what Solomon is realizing is that, after his search, it's all folly. It's all like grasping for the wind. I'm going to say something before we get into our study that I think is important for us to realize. One of the things that we talked about last evening is there are a couple of ways that you can experience the emptiness of life. You can try everything that the world throws at you. You can try it over and over and over again. But in reality, when all is said and done, you're going to discover that you come up empty. Or you can listen to the words of the wise man and avoid the pitfalls of life. And your life is going to be better, and your eternity is going to be sweeter. Now, there are two people in the Bible that we could refer to as prodigals or wasteful people. One, of course, you know about in Luke 15, the prodigal son. But do you realize that there is a prodigal son in the Old Testament as well? And both of the men, both in the Old and in the New Testament, they have a great deal of similarities. And one of the things that they have very much in common is that they were rebelling against the wishes of their parents. And they were actually, in many instances, even rebelling against God. And in both instances, they refused to listen to the wisdom of a previous generation. And the one in the Old Testament, of course, is Samson. In the New Testament, it's the unknown brother that's called the prodigal son. But the point is that I want you to see is that if you decide that you want to try every sin or every temptation or every allurement that the devil has before you, there is a 50% chance that you will never come back to God. Samson died, and the prodigal son returned to God, or returned to his father. And so when you look at that, there's a 50% chance that you'll die in rebellion to God. And this is very, very important. Because what you will find out is what Solomon is trying to get us to uncover, or get us to discover, that life here upon this earth, the things that we see and the things that we experience, is basically just an illusion. It's not what we deem it to be. Now, what I mean by that, and allow me to develop that perhaps even a little better than I did last evening, I mean by that life is deceptive. It's not what it appears at first to be. Life, sin, temptation, it offers you things that it cannot give you. It promises things that it cannot deliver. And so in that context, life is just an illusion. It is deceptive. Listen to what the Hebrew writer said in Hebrews 3 and verse 13. He says that we're to exhort one another daily while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness, that's the key word here, the deceitfulness of sin. Life, sin, temptation deceives us. It is like, we pointed out time and time again, it's like an optical illusion. We see it and then we really don't understand what is it we see. And I like to put up some optical illusions just to give you a visual. How many black dots can you see on the screen? You know, you look at that and your eyes are playing tricks on you. Well, see, this is what the world does. And this is what Solomon discovered. He discovered that the world is playing tricks. This is why he reaches the conclusion to fear God and to keep His commandments. And we look at another chart here, and we wonder, are the wheels that we see, are they turning? Are they moving in some sort of, minor way? Or are they stationary? The more that we look at it and look away from it and look back at it, we're not really sure what we see. Well, this is the way that the world is. I see so many young people, and old people as well for that matter. The world is dangling something to them, and they think, I've got to have that. Well, what you're getting is not what you thought you were getting. Just take for example. In the Old Testament when Adam and Eve were placed in the garden by God and told that they could eat of every tree that's in the garden with the exception of the tree that's in the midst of the garden. And I want you to stop and think about something. They knew where that tree was. They knew what tree it was. They were not to even touch. But now just wait a minute now. I wonder how many times they walked by that tree. How many times did they look upon that tree and just simply keep on walking? But when the devil come along and he began to present this in a way that they hadn't thought about, the tree took on a different air. It just looked different. It looked good for food. And it was a tree that was designed to make them wise. And they began to look at it and it didn't look like it used to. It was promising them something that it couldn't deliver. As a matter of fact, they believed that it promised them the ability to become like God. And as a matter of fact, the devil even convinced them that God was really trying to deprive them. God knows that on the day that you eat of it, Your eyes will be opened and you'll be like God. And so it began to look differently. This is the way the world presents itself. This is the way sin and temptation and allurements in the world presents itself to us. It just looks different, and we sometimes don't realize what it is that we're actually asking for or we're going to partake of. It's an optical illusion. We look at things such as the chart that's on there and we wonder, does C connect to A or does it connect to B? I'm not real sure. It really looks like it connects to B, but I think it connects to A. Well, I'm really not sure. You see, this is the way the world entices us. It entices us to believe something that's not so. It entices us to believe that it's going to give us something that it cannot possibly produce. We are living an illusion under the sun. And the subject this evening is that life on earth, the pursuit of life on this earth, the grabbing all that we can. There used to be a commercial when I was young, on television. Grab all the gusto that you can. You only live once. So, man, you get all that you can this first go-around. Well, what Solomon discovered is, such an attitude as that is merely grasping for the wind. It is merely an illusion. It's grasping for the wind. 9 times in the book of Ecclesiastes, now I won't list all of these, but 9 times in the book of Ecclesiastes, he mentions this concept of grasping for the wind. We've got 6 of these up here. He said in chapter 1 and verse 14, I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and indeed, all is vanity and grasping for the wind. It's trying to grab hold of sunshine. It's trying to bottle sunshine. I set my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceive that this also is what? Grasping for the wind. Then I looked on all the works that my hands had done and on the labor in which I had toiled, and indeed all was vanity and what? Grasping for the wind. Therefore I hated life, because the work that was done under the sun was distressing to me, for all is vanity and grasping for the wind. Chapter 4 and verse 4, again I saw that all the toil and every skillful work of man is envied by his neighbor. Our text this evening, this also is vanity and grasping for the wind. Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of desire. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. I'm going to tell you something. If God's people, if there was some way that I could convince God's people tonight, not just those of you here in this building, but if I could convince God's people throughout the world of this truth, that the hoarding and the accumulation of things and getting bigger and better and more things was just simply grasping for the wind, I'm going to tell you something that would revolutionize the church of Jesus Christ tonight. It would cause us to focus upon the things that we ought to focus upon. It would cause us to become more evangelistic minded. It would cause us to live more purely in the eyes of God. If we could just get a hold of that thought and just believe that and just develop our lives according to that, it would revolutionize us. Now what I want us to do, I want us to consider what it is that Solomon is talking about. I want us to consider this evening the context of our study. And that is that things, I don't care what they are, and I don't care how many there are, things that we're able to accumulate upon this earth will not last. They're transitory. They're vain. They're fleeting. They're not going to endure forever. But now you know what? You contrast that with you and I. You and I, ladies and gentlemen, will endure. You and I will transcend life. You're going to live throughout eternity. Now, what you have on your back tonight and what you drove to this building in and where you will go home tonight and sleep, all of these things are one day going to be destroyed. They're not going to last. They're not going to endure. You, however, will live on in eternity. Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 7, we're going to return, these bodies are going to return to the dust of the earth, but the spirit is going to return to God who gave it. We're going to live on, we're going to exist in eternity. This is something we've got to realize, but everything else is not going to last. Every generation, and I believe especially is this true of our generation, needs to learn this truth. But what I have discovered, ladies and gentlemen, is trying to get the average church member, whether he's a preacher, or whether she's a Bible class teacher, an elder's wife, or someone who occupies a pew, trying to get the average church member to believe that is one of the most difficult things I have ever tried to endure as a preacher. We've got to learn that things are not important. We're living in opulence. Oh, I realize that we could talk about how the economy has tanked in many places, but we're still living in opulence. I have been in third world countries, and I want to tell you something. They would give anything in this world to be able to come to a place like Payton City and live. It's like a brother said to me in Nigeria a number of years ago. He said when he visited America for the first time, he said, Brother J.R., if I didn't understand the Scriptures better, I would have believed that I was in heaven. We're living in opulence here. We're living in prosperity that's been unknown since the creation of this world. And as a result of that, we place an emphasis upon things. And we're allowing things to choke out our relationship to God. Listen to what Solomon says in the 5th chapter of the book of Ecclesiastes. Notice the truth that's contained in these statements. He said, He who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver, nor he who loves abundance with increase. This also is vanity. That's verse 10 of Ecclesiastes 5. You know what? We want to argue with that. And the belief that we have, if I can just get a little bit more, I will be happy. If I can just get this house paid off, I will be satisfied. But Solomon says that's not the way that it is. I've examined this on the earth. It doesn't work that way. As a matter of fact, he's going to go on and point out that the more you have, the more it takes to live. Verse 11, when goods increase, they increase who eat them. If a person is making, so much money and he's living within his means, everything is fine. But you allow those goods to increase, and he buys a bigger and better home with a bigger and deeper mortgage, and he has more expenses, and he's living on another side of town than where he was. You know what? It takes more to live there. And this is what Solomon is saying. This is something that just creates a never-ending cycle. Back in chapter 2, and in verse 18, he said, Then I hated all my labor in which I had toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And then he says in verse 19, And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool, yet he will rule over all my labor in which I toiled and in which I have shown myself wise under the sun. He says this also is vanity. I've talked to men who have created their own businesses. It may be a masonry business. It may be a carpentry business. It may be a garage that works on automobiles. It may be a car dealership. I've talked to these men who worked hard, sacrificed, devoted their lives to building up this business. And you know what? They leave it to a worthless son, and that business goes down the tube when the first generation dies. This is what Solomon is saying. It is all vanity. It's fleeting. It's transitory. It's grasping for the wind. And yet people continue to spend their lives doing just that. Proverbs 15 and verse 16, Better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure with trouble. You just think about the people that you may know that become workaholics, and they neglected their families, they neglected the Lord, they neglected relationships, They forsook the assembling of the church. You know, they took on 2 or 3 jobs. They worked all the overtime that they could. They just got more and more, and they purchased stocks and made investments. And you know what they were doing? They were mortgaging their souls for things that do not last. For 2 handfuls of air. And you know what? I hear Christians, I hear brethren, members of the church begin to brag and crow about all that they possess and all that they have, flaunting the latest things that they have. And they behave as though Jesus did not mean what He said in the sermon, in the parable of the sower in Matthew 13 and verse 22. Jesus said that the deceitfulness of riches, the deceitfulness of things, will choke out the word. And this is something that's played over and over and over. And I'm going to tell you, if you begin to think that you somehow, or I begin to think that I somehow, would be an exception to this, we are deceiving ourselves. Let me challenge you with something. How many parents here actually are teaching their children the truth of what Jesus said in Luke 12 and verse 15? How many of you sit down with your child and say, listen, honey, I want to tell you something. Your life does not consist in the abundance of the things that you possess. No, we say, you be sure that you get a good education. And you be sure that you be wise and frugal in your use of money. And you be sure that you save for the future. And you be sure that you get as much. No, Jesus said, son, your life does not consist in the abundance of the things that you possess. How many of us are actually teaching that truth? Sadly, what we've done is we've bought into the deception that success is measured by how many things we have. Jesus said in Luke 14 and verse 33 that you have to forsake. He said, unless you forsake all that you have, you cannot be my disciple. Now I know what we do with this sometimes. A fellow be up teaching a Bible class and he's studying from Luke chapter 14. And he gets to this section where Jesus is really discussing the idea of commitment. He gets down to verse 33, the last verse in that chapter, where Jesus said, unless you forsake all that you have, you cannot be my disciple. And you know how we usually address it? Well, now, Jesus didn't really mean that. Because you know what? There's nothing wrong with having... Jesus meant something. He meant something here. When He said that we've got to be willing to forsake all, He meant something. You know, the rich young ruler came to Jesus in Matthew 19, wanted to know what good thing that he needed to do to inherit eternal life. You know, he wanted to act like he wanted to go to heaven. Jesus told him, keep the commandments. You know what he said? I've been religious all my life. I've kept these commandments. I've honored my father and my mother. I've done all of these things. Then he asked a question. And have you ever wondered why the rich young ruler in Matthew 19 asked the question that he did? But what is it, Jesus, that I lack? Do you think he knew what he lacked? Do you think he didn't know what was going on in his heart? The devil was in the question that he asked. What is it that I lack? Jesus said, well, you better get rid of this greed, and you better get rid of this covetousness that's in your heart. You better get rid of this love of things. Sell all that you have, give to the poor, and come follow me. And you'll have treasure in heaven. No, he's not willing to do that because he's not willing to root out this love of things. And when Jesus says that we've got to forsake all, that's what he's talking about. He's telling us you've got to get rid of this love of things that is in your heart. You know, I tell people, I grew up in a little, three-room house when I lived with my maternal grandparents until I was 8 years old in a county in Kentucky called Rockcastle County. Everything that my grandparents and I had was in that three-room house. I don't know how many square feet it was because all there was a kitchen, and a place where we had a stove, wood-burning stove in order to heat the house. I guess you could call it a living room and a bedroom. That's it. Everything we had was in that. Now you fast forward, ladies and gentlemen, to today. You fast forward to 2016, and you know what? We have houses that are 3, 4, 5, and 6,000 square feet of living space. We have finished basements and lined attics, 3-car garages. And you know what we're doing? We're storing things in there. And that's not enough. We go out on the highway and pay $250 a month for a garage in which to store more things. I do believe, ladies and gentlemen, that more Christians today need to be detoxed from things and the love of things than they do from alcohol and they do from drugs. We are addicted to opulence. We're addicted to things. And these things do not even last. And I'm going to tell you something. Parents, we better be evaluating the way that we're raising our children because we're just reinforcing the world's view of things. Look at what we buy for holidays. Look what we buy for birthdays. Look what children bring to church services. You know, it's got toy rooms and basements full of the latest toys and games and all of these things. Kids reach the age of 16 and parents go out and buy a car. And then when it comes time for spring break, we send them to Cancun, Mexico for a spring break. And then when they graduate, we send them to Europe on a 2-week or 3-week tour of Europe for graduation. What do we teach? What are we reinforcing in their hearts? Are we reinforcing in their hearts that, hey son, your life does not consist in the abundance of the things that you own and you possess? No, are we reaching the same conclusion that Solomon did? Listen, son, fear God and keep His commandments. This is why you're here. This is why God lets you live upon this earth. These things don't matter. These things are going to perish with their using. These things are going to be taken away one day. What are we reinforcing to our children? You know, and just think about it, not just from the standpoint of things. Just consider this. Consider, you know, we're so proud of our children when they study real hard and they ace a calculus test, or maybe they score in the high percentiles of an SAT. We look at that and we think, well, this is marvelous. And then we'll come to the elders and we'll complain because the Bible study class is too hard for my precious child. And the teacher had the audacity to try to get him to learn a memory verse. What are we reinforcing? What are we teaching our children? Are we teaching our children that, hey, these things do not matter because they do not last? Or what is it that concerns us more? What is it that we get more upset about? Do we get more upset when a child that we have maybe scratches a new car that we buy? That upsets us more than a lie that they tell? You know, what bothers us the most? A broken window or a broken promise? You know, they're able to see through all of this, you know. What is it that troubles us? When they don't score a basket when they play basketball, or they don't get a hit when they play baseball, or they miss a tackle when they play football, does that upset us more than them not getting their Bible lesson for Sunday or for Wednesday? I want us to remember something the Apostle Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, and we alluded to this last evening, but I believe it is important enough for us to consider again. Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, therefore we do not lose heart, verse 16. Why is that, Paul? Even though our outward man is perishing. That's what we're talking about this evening. We're growing old. The outward man is perishing. All of these other things are going to perish with the using. The outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. The more we renew the inward man, the less we fret about the demise of the outward man. The more we renew the inner man, the less we're concerned about things that the outer man has. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. While we do not look at the things which are seen, that's something we need to learn. We do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen, what are they, Paul? He says they're temporary, but the things which are not seen, these are eternal. What you see and what you touch, they're not going to last. They're temporary. Paul said over in 1 Timothy chapter 6, a passage we're all, I'm sure, extremely familiar with. He begins in verse 7 by saying, For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. And having food and clothing, with these we shall be content. But those who desire, listen to him now, but those who desire, those who have this craving, those who have this lust to be rich, fall into temptation and a snare and into many foolish and harmful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. Men, as it's somebody once expressed one time, men make counterfeit money and money makes counterfeit men. We're not to live our lives in that way. Let's notice again in verse 17. Paul says, Command those who are rich in this present age not to be haughty nor to trust in uncertain riches, but in the loving God, who gives us richly all things to enjoy. Let them do good, that they be rich in good works, ready to give, willing to share, storing up for themselves a good foundation for the time to come, that they may lay hold on eternal life. Paul is not saying that it's wrong to be blessed by these things, but Paul says if you happen to be blessed by these things, be generous and share. Use these things for the glory of God. It's like a fellow that I knew several years ago. He come into just a little bit of money, and so he decided that he was going to buy him one of these great big new full-size vans. When they first come out several years ago, really, everybody's wanting one of those, and he bought him one. It just had a lot of nice things in it. But you know what he did with that van? He'd carry people back and forth to church services, and he'd get it and fill it up, and they'd go off somewhere in a gospel meeting. He'd use that thing for the glory of God. Was he blessed with something that was, that wealthy people might? Perhaps so. But he was using it for the glory of God. He was doing exactly what Paul says to do here. Let them do good. Let them be rich in good works, ready to give, and willing to share. Yeah, there's a lot of things that money can buy. Money can buy cars and houses and clothes and entertainment. But these are not going to last. These are certainly not going to endure into eternity. They're going to be just like what Jesus said of the city of Jerusalem in Matthew 24 and verse 2. This house that you have, this mortgage that you have on it, you know what? One day not one stone is going to be left upon another. Everything that we have is going to be destroyed. They will not last. And yet men and women spend their lives amassing wood and mortar and coins and currency and tin and rubber. And we're either going to leave them to somebody else or they'll just rust and be destroyed. And in the process, what we're doing is selling our souls to the devil. Remember what Jesus asked in Matthew 16 and verse 26, For what profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world and loses his soul? Let me again note what is said in the 12th chapter of the book of Luke, and we've alluded to this on numerous occasions. Did so just a moment ago when Jesus tells the parable of the rich farmer. After someone came to him and wanted Jesus to demand that his brother divide the inheritance with him. Jesus said in verse 15, Take heed and beware of covetousness. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses. Then he spoke a parable to them, saying, Here, listen to me now. Jesus said, I'm going to illustrate to you what I mean by that. I'm going to tell you exactly what I mean by that. And here's the story that I want you to know. He said, The ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, What shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops? So he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there I will store all my crops and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, Fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will these things be which you have provided? Jesus, is there a lesson in this? Is something J.R. needs to take from this? And Jesus said, yes. And here's what it is. So is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. This is a lesson that we need to learn. This is what we need to take away. This is a takeaway from this sermon. It doesn't matter how much we have, we're poverty-stricken. We're bankrupt if we are not rich toward God. You know what? I'm going to tell you something. High-priced designer clothes will wear out. $40,000 automobile will rust and have to be replaced. $1,000,000 homes are in constant need of repair. And so it is truly a fool who labors for a handful of wind. And he, as writer said of Ecclesiastes, as he came from his mother's womb, naked shall he return, to go as he came. Just exactly as he came, so shall he go. And here's the question asked again. What profit has he who has labored for the wind? You see, my friend, here's the truth of the matter. God has given you a soul. And that soul that is housed within this tabernacle of clay that's sitting in these seats this evening will live forever. And so I'm going to challenge you tonight. Do not surrender your soul for something that you cannot keep. It is the epitome of foolishness to do so. A man by the name of Philip James Elliott, who was an evangelical missionary, was killed in Ecuador along with 4 others while he was attempting to evangelize the Wudani people. After Elliott's death, his journal was found in which he recorded this statement. He wrote, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose." Jesus said, where your heart is, there your treasure will be also. Do not buy in to this illusion. Do not buy into the allurement of the world. Things, I don't care what they are, will not last, but you will. Are you prepared for eternity? You see, it's all an illusion. Like I told you last evening, it's exactly what the world of beauty and beautiful people know and understand. In order to get you to buy their products, in order to get you to buy their diets, in order to get you to buy their designer clothes, in order to get you to buy their makeup, they present something to you that's not real. And you know, they make a fortune by persuading people to buy into the illusion. Just like this beautiful young woman that's on the screen behind me. When you take away the makeup, you take away the illusion, then you see how she really is. You take away all that the devil has laid before you. You take away the allurement of this world, and you look beyond the glitter and the tinsel and the neon of this world, and you look into eternity, and you reach the conclusion that Solomon reached at the conclusion of his book. Hear that conclusion. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. That's why you live. That's why you breathe God's air. And that is to glorify Him, to love and to serve Him. If you believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, you're willing to repent of your sins, turn from them, confess your faith in Him, and be baptized tonight in water for the remission of your sins, you can be raised to walk in newness of life. You can begin to fulfill the very purpose for which you have been allowed to live upon this earth. That is to fear God and to keep His commandments. If you're subject to the invitation, please come right now as together we stand and as we sing.